Hello, and welcome to the show Writing in the Tiny House. I am on a mission to abolish the idea of the tormented artist by sharing what I know about writing, publishing, and just life in general, so that you can have the tools to produce the content that you have been eager to write. If you have the steps in place, you can produce a short story in as few as 3 months, or a novel in as few as 18 months. And hopefully, through the ideas in this podcast, you will have the wisdom to adjust that timeline if you need to. I am Devin Davis, the guy who lives and writes in a tiny house in northern Utah. Thank you for tuning in, and please enjoy today's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Hello, guys, and welcome to Writing in the Tiny House. It is a big day today, y'all. Today, I finished my first pass of developmental edits with Tiz, the next installment of Tales from Vlador. And we are moving from single person, author all by himself, developmental edits into the collaborative developmental edits where we start to involve other people. So I sent that manuscript to 3 people, one of whom I don't know, which is already a really big, nerve-wracking first, it's a really big step. It's a really brave thing to send your manuscript to somebody that you don't know and ask them to critique it, especially when you know it's not perfect, because you know that they will. And because you don't know them and because they don't have to preserve a friendship, they tend to say things that can be hard to swallow, that can be hard to hear or see or whatever if you're reading a letter, a message. But it's good. It is all a very good, important step. Sending your stuff to a person that you don't know and asking them to critique it is, first of all, a very ballsy thing to do. It is very brave. It is very cool. And so if you have done that already with your own works in progress, bravo. It's a good thing, guys. And then, because this other person, this critique partner that you perhaps found on the internet or whatever, because they are not preserving a relationship, they can go through and just say the things that aren't working. Hopefully, they do it in a constructive way, as a way to help you. Every now and again, you find a critique partner who wants to be honest and blunt, and they end up being rude. But still, if a person is taking time out of their schedule to read your stuff, I mean, hopefully you find these people and they're doing this for free. A lot of people just like to read. And so providing them with unique things to read that nobody else has ever read before can kind of be an adrenaline rush for some people. And so they're already providing you an active service. And so even if some of the feedback ends up sounding insensitive, there are usually many key points in there that are invaluable to your writing process. And it has been my experience that somebody you don't know can see through some of the bullshit of yourself, of your ego, of your experience with your book, cut through it all so that you see it too. So that you see the problems too, and then you can address them with a new set of eyes, with a new point of view. And you can see, oh yeah, that really is a problem. With Brigitte, it was the person that I didn't know who pointed out in the beginning that Brigitte was not a convincing character. And so I got to make her more confident and even sometimes a little more abrasive so that she could come across as a better character. And I am excited for what this other critique partner has to say. And then when you have those bits, that news, the hard truth, you can actually bring up the same points with some of your other critique partners, and then they can be like, oh yeah, I guess that is true. And you can workshop together and brainstorm together and arrive at a better place. So that is where we are with the manuscript with Tiz, and I am excited to move on to that next step and to be in this new place. So I recorded some tidbits of how the process went along the way with this first pass of developmental edits, and I will compile that into an episode, much like I did with finishing the first draft. An episode of audio clips of me in the moment just because when I did that with the first draft, that episode was well received. So we're going to do it again. Apparently, you guys like to hear what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So that's cool. Tune in next week for that episode. It will be similar to the episode of the first draft. So this week, I promised that I would do another episode on developmental edits, just because that is what has been on my brain and I have things to say. This ties directly into developmental edits, but it also ties into just formulating the story to begin with. But anyway, what I want to talk about is a thing called KISS, Kiss, which stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. When we imagine our work in progress, sometimes the things can come across as pretty complicated. And if they are too complicated, they just don't work. With Tis, I really wanted it to have this really big philosophical finish. I really like there to be an amount of allegory in my stories or metaphor or whatever, something that talks about some bigger universal truth as a way to convey a point. Sometimes the way that it's presented simply doesn't work. Or it doesn't work in such a way as making it so obvious. There's a conversation at the end of Tis that I really wanted to work into some of this stuff with a universal point of truth and really drive a thing home and working it into the plot and working it into where the plot needed to go was really a stretch, and it was hard to get there. And I was brainstorming with my developmental editor, Crystal, over how to just get it to work, and it ended up just not working. And so I had to simplify what I was doing and just stick with what was working, and it turned out to be just fine. But almost all of the ideas during that session of brainstorming, almost all of those ideas aren't in the manuscript anymore. And so it's a good lesson to simply keep it simple. On another note, I am halfway through a book. It's a fantasy book. I took a little hiatus from fantasy for a little minute, and I have been complete trash reading teen romance or new adult romance, depending on the day. And that has been fun. It's been a fun break, but I decided to dive back into fantasy with the book that I'm reading now. And it's a big, long book. It's 25 hours of audio. And I am finding this author is the absolute king of infodump. And this ties directly into keeping it simple. I read a middle grade book of his last year and loved it. It was wonderful. This is more of a YA series, and I am in book 2. Book 1 was fine. It was good. It was certainly good enough to carry on with the series. And this author is self-published and has found a way to sell a lot of copies and has a lot of reviews on Amazon. And I love to cheer on a person who has done that completely on their own, who doesn't have a traditional publishing house and is finding a lot of success through doing it this way. I love how it's creating a better reputation and a more realistic possibility for people who want to professionally self-publish. And so I cheer for that, and I love supporting a person who has already done that, and I think it's great. So absolutely, I was enthusiastic to download the second book. But let me elaborate as to what this King of Infodump has done. So sometimes we get into a fantasy book and we have an idea. Oftentimes it is an idea that circulates or revolves around a fantasy magical system possibility. A lot of fantasy books, the most interesting part about them or the most unique part about them can be the magic system. We know a lot of authors that we could just kind of fill in, just plug into that. It is the magic system that makes the book interesting. Sometimes the narration and the way the book is structured focuses so much on the magic system and describing to us how the magic system works and just focusing hyper focusing on the magic system that we lose a lot of other stuff that makes a good story. So what I am realizing with this book that I'm reading, and I'm debating on whether or not I want to set this book down, but I have a hard time setting books down, guys. Especially if I'm 10 hours into it. What I am noticing is almost everything in this book is dedicated to describing the magic system. So not only are there swaths of paragraphs that are describing the way the magic system works, because it is a first-person narrative and it's a student situation where everybody's learning new magic, and that's actually a very common and effective way to teach a magic system to the reader, because the main character is learning it too, so you learn it with them, and then you don't feel like you're being preached to or lectured to, like you're sitting in a science class all about magic and this is a textbook. But there are so many things that this author has chosen to do that are all info dumping on the magic system. Not only is the main character figuring out some of the tips and tricks of his own little part of this magic system, because it is a complicated magic system with a lot of nuance and a lot of rules, and we get to hear all about it. But it appears all of the conversations that this main character has, all of the conversations are about the magic system. It's about describing a different aspect or a different detail or a different application of this magic system. And this is what is happening. It is as if this author found a textbook and decided to somehow stick a narrative in it, or decided to somehow take sections of the textbook and have the characters talk about it with like the glossary of terms and like the questions at the end of the chapter. That's what this entire book is turning out to be. And granted, I'm in book 2, and there was already a lot of that in book 1. And what just barely happened in book 2 is he introduces a second complicated magic system with more rules and more detail and more nuance. And so it's just kind of a lot. But let me tell you what happens when it is that. When we are so wrapped up in the magic system, we often neglect character development. So all of the characters are the same. All the characters have been the same throughout the book. There isn't a complicated relationship between anybody, at least not really. And I mean, one of the characters was really hurt and damaged in a physical, permanent way by the main character in book 1, and like to the point that she can't speak. And there's not really a lot of the emotional ramification of that explored in this book. Also, there is a complicated relationship between the main character and his parents and I guess the rest of his family, but that is more of an excuse to simply not have them in the story. And so this main character has a group of friends, this like chosen family unit that shows up a lot in fantasy fiction. And everybody is just kind of the same, and everybody plays the same roles. Because we are hyper-focused on the ins and outs of the magic in this world, we can't explore the ins and outs of the characters too. There's not room for that, or at least there isn't built into this narrative any of that. So relationships are not evolving, characters are not growing and changing, and the plot itself is pretty basic and isn't growing or becoming more interesting. And all of that I just said kind of makes up the good parts of a book. I mean, the magic system is great, and it is essential for many different types of fantasy fiction. But unless the characters are believable, and unless the plot is fun, and unless there are relationships that grow and evolve and like sour or become better and more intense or something, if there isn't a dynamic there, if things are not growing and changing and whatever as the book progresses, then there isn't anything else to hold my attention. So keeping it simple plays directly into that. If you have something in your book that is too complicated, please find a way or pay attention to all of the things that could be affecting. If you are finding that the characters are talking about nothing except your magic system or your technology or your software or whatever key thing makes the plot happen, then be sure to take note of all of that and hopefully simplify it so that the characters can grow and relationships can change and the plot can become more interesting. So that is what I have to share with you today. Keep it simple, stupid. And next week, be sure to tune in for the episode on my first pass of developmental edits with my manuscript for Tis, the next installment of Tales from Vlador. So thanks, guys, and have a good day. We will see you next week. And that is it for today. Just a reminder that Brigitte, installment 1 of Tales from Vlador, is available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible and Apple Books as an audiobook. And I provide advance reader copies of these short stories as I release them to my patrons. So become a patron today by visiting patreon.com/writinginthetinyhouse to support both my writing and this podcast. And lastly, be sure to follow me on social media. My Instagram is @AuthorDevinDavis, and my Twitter handle is @AuthorDevinD. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and have fun writing. We will see you next time. Run by copy editor Chrissy Barton, Little Syllables Editing is a reliable resource for anyone looking to improve their manuscript. Chrissy does line edits, copy edits, and the final proofread for experienced writers and newbies alike. Go to littlesyllables.com and reach out to Chrissy today. A link is in the show notes.